to own it. Just wanted to take the time, learn all the things that I could about you. Now it's such a mess here. Oh, we are just stressed here. Used to be so easy with you.
Action.
So we're here today outside of Holy Trinity. So tell us the background of this building.
Well, we're going to take a little tour. I'm going to give you a tour today of this whole area. This is the old Armenian town. This is what they used to call this. And this is the epicenter of it, the Holy Trinity Apostolic Church. But this whole area used to be houses, grocery stores, produce stores, dry clean stores, houses everywhere, if you can picture that. The Osprey Club was across the street. A lot of people hung out there. There are houses over there. All the Armenians lived down there.
Was this still considered downtown at the time?
It is downtown, but this particular section, when the Armenians first started coming here, 1880s, 1890s, and settling into parts of Fresno, most of them came to this area and settled, and everyone lived here. If you could just imagine, it's hard to imagine right now because there's cell marinas there and
right.
Hotel across the street, but this was all full of houses. All the important families at the time started here. They couldn't really live in other parts of Fresno, so they migrated to this area, opened up stores, like I said. But the church actually, this is not the original Holy Trinity Church.
Right.
The first one was on F and Monterey Streets, which is back that way, a few streets. That was built in 1900, and it burned down in 1913. So within a matter of months, in 1914, they built this church. And this was actually the first Armenian Apostolic, the first church was the first Armenian Apostolic Church built in California, the second in the entire country. Now this one is unique because it's on the National Registry of Historic Landmarks. This was designated a national landmark on the registry of these. And it's in the architecture of how an Armenian church, how you'd see it in Armenian. The same art. This is the first church in the country like that. This specific architecture of it. So it's very unique. And this is the first church where they called this the Mother Church. Actually, there were three churches down here when everyone lived down there. First Armenian Presbyterian Church. They actually go back to 1897. They're a little bit older, and the people that formed that church started it in 1897. Now they were located on, we're going to walk by them. They were around the back. And then Pilgrim Congregational was here as well. They're all in this area.
And then now they spread a little bit further out.
Now most of them went north, and this is the only one left down here.
So what was the reason for everybody going north of the churches? Did they want to be spread out more? We could find them spread out more. So.
I think that's just how a lot of cities developed to go either north or east. Fresno went north.
When the other one burned down, what was the story behind that?
I don't really know the full story of it. It burned down, and the parish here was so dedicated to building a church, they did it really fast in a matter of months.
But it wasn't any hate crime towards Armenians. I know that a lot of that was going on back then.
I don't think that.
My grandmother told me that some kids were playing with matches and something like that, and that's what caused it to burn.
So some kids might be playing with matches. I hope that's the story. So what else were you going to see right now?
We're going to walk around. A lot of people have not been down to this area a lot. Some people have never even been to this church. This is something everyone needs to see. Now across the street, I looked on a map that somebody drew a map by memory of this area. And it's on our website, armeniansfresno.com. And it shows where everyone lived. And right across there, Michael Connors was born, and that's where he lived.
Wow.
Their name was Ahronian, Prefer Ahronian. The Ahronian family lived right there. And other people did too. The Sagatelian family lived right there. And another unique part about this area is the Valley Bakery, Valley Lavash Bakery. That was built here in 1922. We're going to go walk by that. We're going to walk by that next.
What about William Saroyan? Was he around these cars? Because we're not far from the Saroyan Theater.
William Saroyan grew up in this area. He lived, I think, we're going to go by where he lived down there. There was a school down there that everyone went to, called Emerson School. Everyone in this area went to Emerson School. And Emerson, I'm going to take you by where that was. This is part of the new addition of the church. They've expanded over the years. They've got a really nice hall inside. They have a lot of functions down here now. Very beautiful hall that's totally remodeled, and a lot of weddings and parties down here all the time. So here's the Valley Bakery. This has been here since 1922. The Sagatelian families operated it from day one. And it started with Nizar Sagatelian, daughter Janet, and now granddaughter Agnes runs it.
Wow, they've been back in business for a long time.
And this is one of the landmarks. Several landmarks down in this area. That is one of them. They're the original creators of pita bread. And I have people I know, they order bread from back east and have it delivered all the time from here. So they have a lot of customers, probably worldwide. And now we're on the back side of the church. And this is Santa Clara Street. So if you notice that sign there, it says Armenian. They changed the name of this portion of Santa Clara to Armenian Street in 2015. That was the 100th year anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. And they actually changed part of the street to Armenian Street. I don't know how many other Armenian streets there are. I know there's one in Glendale, but we have one in Fresno too. A lot of people might not know that. So over here is L Street. This next street is L Street, and the Emerson School used to be right here, right where the old high-quality bakery was. Now that closed a couple of years ago when Emerson, when they got rid of the school. That's when high-quality bakery came in, took over the space. That was another bakery in downtown Fresno, Armenian town, where people could get their bread, products, and other items. Now, William Saroyan lived, I believe, on L Street. So this is L Street. And also, my grandmother was born on L Street.
Oh, wow.
One of my grandmothers.
Actually born on L Street.
Right by the school. And she was neighbors to another famous person that grew up on L Street. Kurt Ahronian. You've heard of him, right?
Of course.
The billionaire. So, a lot of people grew up in this area. Again, this would all be houses. A lot of history here.
You know, I made a mistake a while ago. I looked at the map a little closer, and William Saroyan's house was actually on M Street and San Benito, on the corner, not L. I think I said he was on L, but it was M Street and San Benito. Now, San Benito's also famous for being, that's where Varaz Samoilyan's arts studio was. That's where he painted a lot of his famous
Oh, wow.
paintings, and where he worked on David of Sassoon.
So do we know if a lot of these guys were friends
back in the day? Who is the timeline of that?
Well, Varas came here later in life, but
Yeah, he was past Saroyan.
like in the 50s or 60s.
Right.
But William Saroyan was here from birth, and everyone knew him around here. He rode his bicycle around here as an adult. He rode that a lot. My grandmother used to talk about him. She knew him because they grew up right next to each other, right near each other down here. So also down here there was the original Clouds. I think they called it Clouds Wholesale, and now it's Fresno Distributing.
Well, Stephen Clouds.
Yeah, his family's place was here. OK Grocery was down here, but that was run by the Ahronian family. They moved north. Okay, so we're standing on the corner of Fulton Street and Santa Clara. And this is significant because we're standing right here where the original First Armenian Presbyterian Church stood. They built it in 1901. And actually that church is significant because it was the first Armenian church established in California in 1897. They used to have another place where they met at, but they built the church here in 1901, and actually there's a sign up there talking about it. And William Saroyan went to this church. A lot of the people that lived in this area went to this church. When Armenians started coming over, a lot of them, the first ones to come over, were Protestant Armenians. And my grandmother was one. She went to this church. So this was great to have in the area. And then they started having the other churches come to the area as well. We're going to go see where Pilgrim Congregational Church was. That's down the road a little bit. We already saw where Holy Trinity was. When First Armenian Presbyterian Church moved out of here, St. Paul took over the spot. St. Paul Apostolic Church was right here.
Wow.
From the 1940s to 50s until they went a little bit more north that way and had another church. This is a very significant spot here. Now it's just a parking lot. But a lot of great memories here. Now, my grandmother I was talking to you about, she was the one that lived on L Street. Her last name was Bacon. She was the only grandparent of mine born in Armenian town. My other grandparents, though, were born, one of them in New Jersey. His name was Tucson. He had to change his last name because at that time he was in business and there was a lot of discrimination going on. And he figured it's probably best if I didn't have an Armenian last name if I'm going to be in business, especially in the Fresno area.
Now it's very common changing the last names.
A lot of people had to change their last names. My other grandparents were born in the Fresno area, but out in the country. One was born in Parlier, Fowler area, the other in Malaga. So we're all kind of from this area, but only one of my grandparents born down here, and she went to this church.
Now, we have a big farming community, so a lot of us are farming. So the ones that live out there, those are the ones involved in the farming, right?
Yeah, actually all of them were farmers. Okay, so we're walking back along Santa Clara. We're going to head towards an area that's been in the news recently. Kind of talk about some of the things going on presently, and everything we've done so far has been in the past. But I like the past. I like history. But if you look that way, if you go that way, that's where the city of Fresno was. Even though these were all houses, this was all somewhat of a ghetto area, as they might say now. But the city was right there. It was within walking distance. And this was before cars, 1890s, early 1900s. So even though they lived here and it wasn't the greatest of environments, everything was down here.
Yeah, you go to church, you go to school, you walk to all of those, you walk to the deli and the bakery.
They could walk to the department store. Gottschalk's was down there.
Oh, that's right.
To the courthouse, which was down there. Everything was within walking distance when you were down there. Walking towards, again, this is where the Emerson School used to be.
high quality bakery was up here for a while. They closed up a couple of years ago, like I mentioned. There's this really good bakery, though, out in Sanger. It's been around a long time. No one really talks about them, but that's an Armenian bakery, and their bread is served all across the world. I'm in stores on the other east coast of the country, and I see Akmak bread. Do you happen to know who handles that bakery?
Yeah, you know it came from my family, so and that's it's interesting though how we have been here for a long time, because a lot of times people don't realize how long ago the genocide was, and then a lot of us artisans, that's the reason we're all here. So our families escaped that, and then that's why we have the roots that we have.
And there was massacres and discrimination and murders and killings going on before the genocide. The genocide was just part of the whole situation going on. My family, they left that part of the world in the 1890s, and it was bad back then.
They got out at the right time.
They got out at the right time, and we're very fortunate to come to the United States to establish our roots here, because this is a great country. We still have some freedoms left, but over there, they might not have made it. My one grandmother that lived down here, her mother was an orphan. Her entire family, except for her, were killed. And she happened to go to an orphanage. She was adopted by Mr. Avakian. That's how she ended up in Fresno. And actually, they just built a monument at the Holy Trinity Church for George Mardikian, who was famous for helping orphans out. He brought over quite a good number of orphans into the United States.
Wow.
After the genocide happened.
That was actually more after World War II.
After World War II. He brought over thousands of orphans after World War II. So now we're standing at one of the areas that you've probably heard a lot about recently. Valley Lavash Bakery is right across from us. Caddy corner is Holy Trinity Church. And this was where they relocated 5 houses to. They put the houses here. They had a master plan, which they called Old Armenian Town, to develop this entire area. Now they started it with the Court of Appeal that they put in over there. There's supposed to be other buildings in place. The idea was to have restaurants, parks, and these houses here as just part of the whole plan, the Armenian theme. And there's even going to be a museum here with a park in it. And then a couple of years ago, 2020, 2 of the houses burned down by arson. There's a lot of vagrants down here living amongst this area. They got into the houses burned down. So now the controversy revolves around whether or not they'll ever do anything here Armenian thing. And I'm not going to talk about the politics of the matter. It's not the appropriate place. I think there should be something down here because it fits within the whole theme. Whether or not it happens or how they do it, we don't know what's going to happen there. But it would be really nice to have a museum down here, have a park, more development. There's empty lots over there, and this would be a great area. People all over the country who come here would want to see this part of Fresno, all the history. I've been out to the cemetery before, and people are there looking at the cemetery. They're not even from Fresno. They're just sightseeing. And
Right.
It's kind of morbid to say that, but there's a lot of important things at the cemetery.
And Fresno is the center of the Armenian diaspora community. You ask anybody in the world about Fresno, they know Fresno.
Right. Fresno is the center of the Armenian diaspora community. Everyone all around the world knows where Fresno is because of that. And this would be a huge tribute if you put something here to that effect. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It's hard to get in here and see what these houses look like, but these were on other parcels nearby, and they're shells. There's nothing inside of the houses, but it's too bad that we let this happen in this area.
And then that was in 2020 when we were having all of the problems in Armenia as well.
A lot of things going on in 2020.
A lot of things, yes.
And this was one of the kickers of it, letting these things burn down.
So thank you for meeting me here today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your show. April 24th, as you know, is Genocide Commemoration Day in the state of California. This is the first year that it is an official state holiday. And the Armenian Genocide, it's commemorating all genocides, this holiday, but the Armenian Genocide is used as the model example for this holiday. Just like the Armenian Genocide was the model for all genocides that followed it. Think of the Armenian Genocide as an open source computer program where it was created by the Turks in 1915, and then subsequent dictators used it and tweaked it and modified it for their own needs. Adolf Hitler, Pol Pot, Slobodan Milosevic, all the great dictators of the world, all the great genocide perpetrators used what was created by the Turks against the Armenians. As we commemorate the genocide of the Armenians, we are also concerned about the genocide ongoing in Armenia. Many people think that the Armenian genocide, we've seen stories about it, we've seen the timelines that are thrown out there, 1915 to 1917, 1915 to 1918, these random dates. But in reality, the Armenian genocide never actually ended. There was no proclamation ending it. There was no recognition by the Turkish government of it. There was no recognition, there was no reparations, no restitution, nothing like that. The victim is still left unwhole, and the perpetrator is still walking around free. And so in 1918, when the Armenian Republic was founded, it was founded pretty much by the genocide survivors, those people that retreated with the Red Army back to the east. All of the historic Armenian homeland had been depopulated of Armenians. Those that remained were basically in Constantinople. Everybody else was either dead or fled to all corners of the world. And so there was really nobody left there who was survived, moved, and helped found the first Armenian Republic. As soon as it was founded, the Turkish government made it clear that they wanted to eliminate the Armenians politically and geographically. And they took great steps toward that goal, attacking the new Armenian Republic. It was a very weak state to begin with, full of genocide survivors and surrounded by enemies. And so the Turks attacked and they attacked. The Armenians did a very good job of holding them off. And in 1920, the Soviet Union came in and subsumed the Armenian Republic, and it became the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. At that point, it was put on hold. All those Armenians that were in Soviet Armenia were now safe from the Turkish sword. keeping in mind that everything that was in historic Armenia, all the churches, as a prime example, the monasteries, were either destroyed, neglected, picked apart, used as building materials for homes, used as target practice, converted to mosques, that type of thing. But the Armenians themselves were safe in Soviet Armenia. And so the Turks, of course, had it as their goal to eliminate the Armenians. And they decided to basically patiently wait to see what happens. And so Turkey waited for 70 years. And that's when, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And that was due in large part, of course, to the perestroika and glasnost, the reforms and openness that Gorbachev instituted. And that allowed Armenians to start protesting for reunification with Artsakh, which I'll get to pretty soon. But as soon as the republic was became independent, the Turks were already drawing up plans to attack. In the meantime, of course, Turkey by that point had a pretty sullied relationship with the world. Their reputation was pretty shot. They couldn't just go in. But they did blockade Armenia. It's been blockaded almost since the very beginning of 1991. And so while Turkey was biding its time, waiting for the Armenians to be vulnerable again, Turkey was involved elsewhere in its denial campaign. Going back to 1934, for sure, in America. Many people know the story of the 40 Days of Musa. It's a story about Armenians basically being pushed up against the coastline and on the Mediterranean coast, and the Turks coming down to attack them, and they held them off for 40 days, and until they made a big flag, a white flag with a big red cross on it, and the French rescued them. And so the Armenians that were there there was a very big story about that. Franz Werfel wrote a book called The 40 Days of Musa, and MGM was going to make it into a movie in 1934, and it was going to star an up-and-coming actor named Clark Gable. And the Turks got wind of this, and they sent their ambassador to contact MGM, whether it was Goldwyn or Mayer, I'm not sure which one, but he contacted them and says, if you produce this movie, you will never show another MGM movie in Turkey again. Keep that in mind. Also, Mr. Mayer, Mr. Goldwyn, whichever he was, they were both Jewish, he says, the ambassador says to him, there's a lot of Jews in Turkey, and they're doing pretty well. Let's keep it there.
Wow.
So it goes back for quite a while. In the meantime, of course, those Armenians and other minorities in Turkey were being treated as second-class citizens. The Armenians, the Greeks, Jews, Assyrians, and such. So now fast forward to the 1990s. Turkey, of course, is still very heavily involved inside the Beltway, inside Washington, D.C., trying to quash any type of discussion, let alone recognition, of the Armenian Genocide. And so they have their lobbyists and such. And of course, keep in mind, Turkey is part of NATO. And people talk about them as a NATO member. They're not as a NATO ally. They're not an ally, they're a member. And Turkey has become sort of like that tenured professor. They can do no wrong and they can never get kicked out. And that's what they do. And so Turkey has been very heavily involved in campaigning to keep the Armenian Genocide under wraps. Granted, they were part of NATO. They did serve a relatively good purpose, keeping the Soviets in check in the Black Sea during the Cold War. And they took advantage of that. Of course, they invaded and occupied Cyprus in the 1970s, brutally. And so Turkey got away with what it could. And so going forward in the 1990s, they were working their lobbyists. And they also, of course, had the Israeli lobby helping them out as well. There was an interview done by the Library of Congress with a former U.S. ambassador to Turkey, a very high-ranking diplomat, Armenian Career, Kaerer, I believe is her name. And she gave this interview and was very frank and very clear about just how, back in the 1990s at least, the State Department felt about Armenians and the so-called Armenian Genocide. Talking about really that Armenians were, of course, attacking Turks, and they kind of had it coming. And all these all these interviews that were done so many years down the road by these 80-year-old men that were 5 years old at the time. What did they know? This didn't happen. But what they also pointed out was that Israel was very much opposed to Armenian genocide recognition as well, because as this ambassador said, they didn't want to share the genocide label with anybody else. And I wrote about that in 2010 for the Fresno Bee, and didn't apologize about it then. I don't apologize about it now. People said, how can you say that about Israel? You know, they survived the Holocaust. I said, well, as I pointed out in my article, you're either a perpetrator or you're a victim of race extermination. It can't be both. And I'll get to more of what Israel has been doing against the Armenians in a moment. But that's what they were doing. And so one of the things that Turkey did was that it decided to put Dennis Hastert, our Speaker of the House, on its payroll. And this knowledge came about in the early 2000s. There was a woman named Sybil Edmonds. Sybil was Turkish, her husband's American, and she was an FBI translator. She was Turkish and translated documents, and she came across this information that said, hey, Dennis Hastert is on the Turkish payroll. And she was sort of a whistleblower, and it didn't go too well for her. There was an article in Vanity Fair, I think in October of 2005, really giving details about how the person who was third in line for our presidency was on the Turkish payroll. And that got no press. And in fact, just the opposite, Sybil Edmonds, between George Bush and Condoleezza Rice, was basically shut down. A gag order and such was pretty much enforced on her because America has a pretty cushy relationship with Turkey, and everybody knows about the Armenian Genocide. This is not this idea that back in the 1980s and 90s that we don't really know what happened or not is pretty absurd, given how much press was going on in 1915 and 1916. The New York Times had dozens, over 100 articles over that time period, detailing in very good detail what was happening. People getting all these deportees and the mass atrocities and the witnessing of the torture and brutality. Everybody knew about this. The State Department, Henry Morgenthau, the ambassador at the time, I think it was in June or July of 2015, sent a cable to the State Department that says this is simply race extermination under the guise of war. And he called it out right from the get-go. National Geographic had an article in September of 1915, capturing the genocide in real time. And they really did a very detailed job in pointing out just the absolute suffering of the Armenians and how this pitiful race of people has been suffering and suffering and suffering for so many decades and into the centuries at the Turkish hand. And pointed out, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but it said something to the effect that the world has never seen a more determined effort to rid the world of a race of people. And it's a very good article, very detailed, very long, but worth the read. And so everybody knows about what's going on. This is not news to people. In fact,
And the U.S. houses many of the genocide survivors.
they took in a lot, of course. There was so many, not only the ambassador in, I guess it would be Constantinople at the time, but all the various consulates in the countryside, as well as the missionaries, as well as, of course, after the genocide, there was the Near East Relief Foundation, which really gathered up all those orphans that were left behind, whose fathers had been murdered, whose mothers had been dragged off to be raped and turned into baby machines for the Turkish society. What's interesting, I think this is kind of funny, is that today the numbers are maximum maybe 40% of Turks today in Turkey because of women that were taken off to be wives, the little boys that were that didn't make it to the safe orphanages, but were rather sent to these re-education orphanages where they were to be, they were given Turkish names, they were barred from making the sign of the cross, because Armenians, of course, are Christian, the first Christian nation, as many people know. They were barred from doing that. They were barred from saying their old name, barred from any type of Armenian words. And in fact, if they ever got caught doing something, the punishment was beyond horrendous. I can't think of the word that's used, but the torture machine is where their feet are basically put into this device. Their bare feet are locked down, and the bottoms of their feet are just brutally whipped. And anybody who's been tickled on their feet knows just how sensitive they are. And these were done to little boys. So those little boys eventually grew up to be Turkish men. The women, of course, at childbearing age or a little bit before, still knew who they were. They didn't have to go through that. They were just simply second-class citizens of Turkish society as women. So everybody knew what was going on back then, and the idea that the genocide never happened is ridiculous. Of course, now it's a foregone conclusion. Everybody knows about it. No one talks about, unless you're a hardcore denialist and or a complete idiot, or on the Turkish payroll. No one talks about the alleged Armenian genocide or the Armenian massacres. It's pretty common knowledge, and that's due really to a lot of advocacy. I've been writing for the Fresno Bee's opinion page on Armenian issues going back 30 years, and from what I'm told, I made an impact on the way the outside world sees Armenian issues. You know, you and I can talk all day about the Armenian genocide because you know about it. Your previous guest, Jeff Ahronian, who's been a lifelong friend of mine, he and I can talk about that all day long. What's the point? The point I make is to let other people know about our history, because there has been an intentional ignoring of Armenian issues. Pretend it doesn't exist or twist it around. And this irrelevantization of the Armenian nation is not good, and I'm fighting against that. And we certainly appreciate you having us on your show today to talk about these issues, whether it's the Fresno story or the worldwide Armenian story. So, as time has gone on, Dennis Hastert, of course, went by the wayside. And here's something else about that incident with him and the House of Representatives and Israel's involvement in the Armenian genocide denial, is that there was a House resolution that was going to pass. It was almost guaranteed to pass. And at the last minute, basically Turkey calls up Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv calls up AIPAC, the American-Israeli Political Action Committee. AIPAC calls Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton calls Dennis Hastert and says, pull it. And at the last minute, it was pulled. Literally at the last minute. And it was absolutely devastating for anybody who believed in justice for the Armenian genocide. Just last couple of years ago, Joe Biden finally said, it's called the genocide. He recognized it. Great. But that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the Armenian genocide issue. It's not just about recognition. It's about reparations, giving me my stuff back, restitution, paying me for what can't be given back. And then we can have reconciliation. No one wants to be enemies forever, and I don't think the Armenian people want to be enemies with anybody. We've done nothing wrong, frankly. Armenians did nothing to deserve being on the receiving end of genocide. They've done nothing to be on the receiving end of this denialist campaign, and we've done nothing to be on the receiving end of this being completely ignored. And so, of course, over time, we've had presidents, George Bush and Barack Obama, both promised to recognize the genocide. And no sooner did they get sworn in, they were talking about the alleged, the mass atrocities of World War I and all that other nonsense. And it got pretty frustrating for a lot of people. And more people start realizing what's going on. Now, I referenced earlier when Armenia became independent in 1991, and Glasnost and Perestroika, and the Armenians who were demanding and protesting, assembling and protesting for reunification or unification with Artsakh. Some people know it as Nagorno-Karabakh. That's a Russian and a combination of Turkish words, which means the mountainous black garden. That's the Soviet word for it. It's always been known as Artsakh. And one thing to understand today is that Armenia and Artsakh are two separate countries. Artsakh, and that's in the news these days right now. We have a lot of concern about the genocide continuing today. As I talked about when we started, the Armenian genocide never ended. And it's continuing as we speak with Azerbaijan, the country to Armenia's east, blockading the only road to 120,000 Christian Armenians living in Artsakh. Artsakh is an historic Armenian province dating back, inhabited by Armenians for centuries, if not millennia. And we know that because the churches there are over 1,000 years old, and the monasteries, some of them, which predates the arrival of the Turks and such. And so when the Soviet Union subsumed Armenia and Soviet Azerbaijan and the Caucasus republics, Joseph Stalin, who was not the premier at the time, he was the Commissar of Nationalities, very Red Scare Soviet type of a title to have, a Commissar of Nationalities. And he didn't really care for Armenians too much. He was actually Georgian. I'd actually been to his house in Georgia.
Really?
I actually sat in his train car in the city of Gori. And there, I've lived in Armenia after law school for about five and a half years in the late 90s, early 2000s. And we did a road trip up to Georgia and other areas, and we stopped in the town of Gori. And there's this house, and in that town, in the town square, there's a statue of him. Now, I've seen plenty of Lenin statues. I've never seen a Stalin statue. Pretty interesting to see him there. But nonetheless, he decided, as part of his divide and conquer policy with the various ethnic groups in the Soviet Union, to give Artsakh to the Azeris. Azeris are basically Turks. And by doing that, he basically put it inside of Azerbaijan such that it was really disconnected from Armenia proper. The Armenians there were second-class citizens. But what they did have was that Artsakh was an oblast, which is a political entity, like a county, if you will. And they had certain rights. And over the 70 years of the Soviet Union, the Armenians petitioned Moscow many, many times to have reunification. Well, it kind of came to a head toward the end of the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians were protesting in Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, which is older than Rome, by the way, protesting for reunification. You can't have two people protesting on the streets in the Soviet Union, but we had hundreds of thousands of people demanding reunification.
Wow.
And so what the Armenians of Artsakh did during the Soviet years, before the Soviet Union actually ended, was they voted to secede from Soviet Azerbaijan. They followed the letter of the law. It was almost a unanimous vote to secede, and they did. And as soon as that happened, the Azeris in Baku, in Sumgait, another city as well, turned on the Armenians like the Turks did in 1915. They hunted them down in the streets. Women were beaten, they were raped, people were burned alive, they were murdered. The Armenians were driven out. And conversely, the Azeris that were living in Soviet Armenia at the time were given a choice. You can leave or you can die. So Armenians were a bit more diplomatic and pleasant about the whole thing versus just going on a killing spree like the Turks did. And so that then began a war. The Azeris started to attack the Armenians of Artsakh, and they met with some very good success, the Azeris did. But then the Armenians realized that what was happening in 1991, 92, 93 was simply a continuation of what was happening in 1915. And we know the end result. It's death to everybody. Loss of your land, loss of your culture, loss of your churches, loss of everything. And so they fought back, and they won. And it was incredible. I recall watching the news reports. I get tingly just thinking about that success. Because if you look at, and I've been to Artsakh, I was first there in 1997, even before the Lachin corridor road connecting Armenia to Artsakh was completed. It was a dirt road, very unpleasant to drive on. But you saw these bombed out Azeri villages, and I'm certainly not advocating war anywhere, but a certain sense of pride came over me when I thought, okay, now it's our turn. We didn't ask for this. We didn't ask for war. We asked for our independence, and we got it. You asked for war, and this is what's happening. And to see that was kind of an interesting moment. The Armenians there are very proud, very strong. Most people have heard of, that Armenians were the first Christian race on the planet. What many people don't know is that the Armenians were the first people to fight a war in defense of their Christianity in 451 AD. Vartan Mamagonian, who's one of our patron saints, is actually from Artsakh. And so, of course, if you know the story about the Battle of Avarar, where the Armenians fought the Persians to keep from being converted to paganism and keep their Christianity, the Armenians were slaughtered. But the Persians saw that the Armenians didn't just wear their Christianity as an item of clothing, but it went to their bone. And they thought, you know what, if it's that important to you, keep it. And so we've been that way for 1700 and how many years now? 1720 21 years, doing the math right, 22 years, 301 AD, 1400 years, whatever it is. But we've also suffered for not only our race, but our Christianity. And that came to a head, of course, in 1915. Jeff Ahronian was talking earlier about his family, his grandmother's family, coming in the 1890s. The Armenian Genocide was the culmination of a few decades of more and more and more persecution against the Armenians. Abdul Hamid II, the bloody Sultan, went on killing sprees, 200,000 people here, 150,000 people here, 1894, 1904, 1909, all these massive massacres. And then, of course, it culminated with the genocide. And, of course, we always use April 24th as the commemoration date when it started. But really, it started a bit before that. In late 1914, the Armenian men who were in the military, the Ottoman army, when they were conscripted, basically at one point they were disarmed, became slave laborers, either worked to death or shot to death. So by the time April 24th rolls around, all the muscle is gone. April 24th rolls around, all the civic, political, religious, business leaders are rounded up and killed. Now the brain's gone. So what do you have left? You've got children, women, the elderly. It's easy pickings. And in fact, we talk about the 1.5 million people that were killed. What many people don't realize is that we reached that 1 million point, that 1 million death mark, if I'm not mistaken, by the end of the summer of 1915. So
Wow, okay.
So I did the math on this. Between April 24th and August 31st of 1915, that is 8,000 people murdered every day.
Wow, okay.
So picture that. That's more efficient than Adolf Hitler's machine. Speaking of Adolf Hitler, seems to be everybody's favorite tyrant. He was deliriously in love with Kemal Atatürk, who founded the Turkish Republic. He was deliriously in love with the three pashas, Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, Jamal Pasha, the three heads of the Young Turks who organized the genocide. And he saw how they got rid of this undesirable race of people, the Armenians, and fended off the Western powers when they tried to divvy up Turkey. And keep in mind also, Turkey and Germany were allies during World War I. There were a lot of German soldiers in the Ottoman Empire. Not only did they witness what was going on, and a lot of them took photos and brought them out, and we see a lot of their photos, but they also participated to a certain degree as well. And so when we talked about what happened after that, many of us in Fresno, I think any good Armenian knows who Solomon Tolerian is, he brought justice to Talat Pasha in Berlin in 1921, I believe. Saw him on the street, pulled out a gun, put a bullet in his head. And when he dropped on the ground, he said, "I killed a man, but I'm not a murderer." He was put on trial, and as the trial starts to move, the German officials are realizing, we might want to nip this in the bud right now, because they're going to start talking about why he did this and what he witnessed in the Ottoman Empire and who he witnessed doing. It wasn't just the Turks. It was also the German officers and such. Granted, it was a minimal part, but certainly it was the Turks. But they decided to just end this trial right now. Off you go. And in fact, the next year, a few other Turks were killed in Germany by Armenians. They weren't even charged with anything because they thought, let's just leave this alone. And so Germany saw what they were doing and thought this would be a pretty good idea. What concerns me is that we hear it all the time, tyrants compared to Nazis. And there's no question that the Nazi political party was a very destructive force in human history, led by Adolf Hitler. And my German friends will tell me Adolf Hitler was actually Austrian. They always remind me of that. That's fine enough. I remind them that the Germans also took part in this. But nonetheless, this was a political party that ran for 25 years from about 1920 to 1945. That party is over. I believe that the Turkish Republic and Azerbaijan are a greater threat to human civilization than the Nazis ever did. Because we all know what the Nazis do. They stick their arm out, they got their salute, they have their special salute, right? When they Heil Hitler, that thing. But the Turks are an incredibly fascist, nationalist, hardline, intolerant society. Now, people are saying, well, isn't that a bit racist? No, and I'll tell you why. Because for the last 100 years, part of the Turkish educational system has been that the children are taught that no genocide happened. In fact, just the opposite. The Armenians tried to commit a genocide against the Turks, and the Turks held them off, and the glorious, better people prevailed. And we vanquished the bad enemy, the Armenians. That's what's taught in Turkey today. And so you have this race of people that believe that they are not only superior, but have a right to go back to Europe and not only get to the gates of Vienna, where they were turned away in the 1600s, but to actually move beyond that. And so one of the ideas about Turkey and Turks is this idea of pan-Turkism. The Turks rolled into the Anatolia from the Central Asian steppe, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, those areas. And their idea of pan-Turkism is to unify all the Turkic republics, from the Asian steppe all the way to the Bosphorus, where Constantinople is. And their idea, of course, there's one thing standing in the way of that, and that's Armenia. There's a little stretch of land about 20 miles wide that separates Azerbaijan from Turkey. And they are more than happy to end up finishing off the Armenians, at least in that southern area to connect the two. And then at that point, they own the southern half of Europe, the Turks do. Once the ceasefire for the war with Artsakh and Azerbaijan was signed in 1994, immediately thereafter, the Azeris were violating that ceasefire. Non-stop border incursions, sniper fire. Aliyev, the head of the dictator in Azerbaijan, said he was going to take back Azerbaijan by force. They have oil off their coast, a lot of oil, and very corrupt. And so what they've been doing over the last decade has not only been buying off journalists and political leaders in Europe to whitewash all their atrocities, but they've been spending about $5 billion purchasing arms from Israel. They've had almost 100 cargo flights from Baku, Azerbaijan to Israel. And I'm not talking little puddle jumpers, I'm talking full 747s that the Azeris own. And they've been using cluster bombs, suicide drones. The Azeris also used white phosphorus, which is banned. Cluster bombs are also banned. But I'm not going to tell you where Azerbaijan got their white phosphorus, but I'll tell you this much: the country they got it from, the color of their flag is blue and yellow. So Azerbaijan has been buying all these weapons. And they had a 4-day war back in 2016. And then in summer of 2020, there was more of an incursion. And then in September of 2020, on the almost 100th anniversary of when the Soviets rolled in, they attacked. 44 days of war. Cluster bombs, suicide drones, churches, civilians, maternity hospitals, civic centers, you name it, they were targeted intentionally. And not a single word on the press. Hardly anything, really, compared to everything else that we see.
Right.
And so now a lot more people are getting aware of what's going on. I think hopefully people are getting tired of watching the Azeris thumb their nose at Western values and ideals. In fact, we've turned a blind eye and open arms to Turkey and Azerbaijan for far too long. Those are countries whose values and ideals are the complete opposite of America and complete opposite of Armenia. Armenia is a democracy, a free and fair democracy. Turkey is not. Azerbaijan is not. On any rights or freedoms scale, Turkey and Azerbaijan are almost at the bottom of those scales, almost always at the bottom of those scales. Armenia is in the middle or even higher. Armenian values and American values line up. Freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, women's rights, democracy, civil society, free and fair elections, all the things that we value that you see nothing of in Azerbaijan and Turkey, but you see all the time in Armenia and Artsakh as well, and we're ignored. And that has to end. It's high time that the United States government stop appeasing Turkey and Azerbaijan. And we know what appeasement does.
So what can we do? What's the solution?
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking. I will tell you what we can do. And certainly this applies to Armenians who are watching this show. But it's about advocacy. Anybody who believes in the values of America, I think would necessarily believe in the values of Armenia and would want to advocate for Armenia. I think Armenia and Azerbaijan are the canaries in the coal mine right now. If Armenia and Artsakh are the canaries in the coal mine. If Artsakh falls, God forbid, and Azerbaijan takes the southern part of Armenia, cutting it off from Iran, then it'll give the green light to all the dictators in the world, China toward Taiwan, Russia toward the Baltics, Turkey toward the rest of Cyprus, Israel toward Palestine. All those countries, all those people are going to be at risk because apparently it doesn't matter. If you're a small democracy with nothing to give, you don't have oil. That's how the West sees these things, and that has to end. We're better than this as human beings, as people that love and believe in democracy and freedom. People need to stand up. Contact your state representative, your congressman, your member of Congress, your senator. I talked to Tom McClintock's office last week and reminded him through his staff that he had co-signed a letter with Adam Schiff. Opposite ends of the political spectrum, those two, but they believe and understand that Armenia is more important than sort of petty politics. Adam Schiff wrote a letter decrying that the U.S. envoy to the South Caucasus has taken sanctions completely off the table toward Azerbaijan. Adam Schiff wrote that letter. Tom McClintock was one of the co-signers of it. And so I reminded Congressman McClintock's office to say, if you signed a letter with Adam Schiff, you can co-sponsor House Resolution 108, which condemns Azerbaijani aggression and the blockade that's been going on for almost 4 months. One phone call is all it takes sometimes. Everybody needs to do something. This is a free and fair democracy. We have a voice. Everybody has a voice. Everybody should be saying something. Don't just sit there, and especially to the Armenians who watch this, who think, well, someone else will do something. So there'll be a presentation at Fresno State. The Armenian Studies program will have something. Marshall will write something for the Fresno Bee. Do something. Care about your homeland and your people and your culture and your race. We are American citizens, and we're very proud of that, of course. But we're also Armenian, and we hold that, at least some of us do, very dearly, very closely. And I think people at this point in the game really need to step up. Armenians certainly, but anybody who knows Armenian. This is Fresno in the Central Valley. You know an Armenian. Anybody watching the show knows an Armenian. And they love our food, they love our music, they love our hospitality, love our country, love our culture, and make a phone call and advocate with us.
Thank you so much for coming on my show today.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Felt right in the morning, felt right in the summertime, it felt right drinking cherry wine with you. Just wanted to own it, just wanted to take the time, learn all the things that I could about you. Now it's such a mess here, oh we are just stressed here, used to be so easy with you. Now I must confess here, oh I must confess dear, don't think I'm in love with you. Winter is coming and I don't know what to do, and there's no more use in running, no more running to you. And I don't want your loving, I don't wanna be just friends, knowing all this time we were playing pretend.
It's a mystery.